Hello. Today we are going to be talking about Ignatius of Antioch. He's got to be one of the most interesting, fascinating characters to study. I mean, one, he's writing so close to the time of the New Testament, early 100s. He has some of the most sort of unique things to say as you see Christianity start to develop in new ways, and maybe it's a faithful development, but we're definitely seeing new ideas, new approaches in Ignatius. And he's treasured and respected by all who quote him and cite him in the generations that follow. Now, that doesn't mean we can't question him. There's so much we could talk about with Ignatius, but for this video, I've got to really keep it focused. What we want to get to is sort of his view of martyrdom. He allegedly dies as a martyr himself, and so you always see him pictured with lions. He even talks about how he's been chained to hyenas.
It's not funny, Ed.
Which is probably talking about soldiers and things. But anyway, whether he died fed to the lions or other beasts like hyenas.
Hey, shut up! Will you knock it off?
What we have in Ignatius is someone who's committed to martyrdom. He knows this is the way of the cross, and this is vital to your salvation. So before we can get to martyrdom and salvation, though, we have to see his role as a bishop that leads him into martyrdom, because you can't talk about Ignatius without his contribution to the idea of the bishop's office. So let's start there. Well, while on his way to Rome, he's been arrested, chained to these hyenas or soldiers, and he's about to go to Rome to be martyred. He writes these 7 letters to churches along the way, and one of the things he's constantly telling them is to obey their bishop. In fact, he says it usually like this: obey the bishop as the Lord. Now, that's where we, in the low Protestant churches like Baptists who don't believe in bishops, we get a little nervous about this.
It's not funny, Ed.
We don't think we're so happy with bishops having that kind of authority. You have to obey the bishop as the Lord? I mean, every time he says jump, you have to ask how high? Does he tell us to go wash his car and shine his shoes? Surely this is too much, Ignatius. Well, Ignatius certainly has a lot of interest in investing authority in the bishop, and he's a bishop, not surprising. But I think the best way to understand him has come up in several recent studies, to look at what the bishop tells you to do, and that's why you obey him. Because you actually have this phrase in other places, like the Didache, which we've already talked about. When you obey the bishop as the Lord, there seems to be a clue there. As the Lord. This can be summarized in a Latin phrase that says in persona Christi. And this is used to explain any sort of sacramental view of God actually working through the sacraments of the church. So in persona, it's not so much the person as the role, the persona of Christ. Who is in the role or person of Christ in the Christian worship service, in the church? Well, it's usually whoever is presiding, the bishop. Now, when the bishop does the role of Christ, and remember, what sort of thing does Christ say? Christ says things like, baptize in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Christ says things like, do this in remembrance of me. So when people are in that role, saying things that Christ himself says, well, then you obey the bishop as the Lord. It's not every time the bishop tells you to wash his car. It's this idea for Ignatius, and for Ignatius, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion is so central to all of his thought. Every Sunday, it's clear that they are having this formal Eucharistic event, this breaking of bread together in the name of the Lord. And when the bishop says, do this in remembrance of me, I mean, who does he think he is saying remember himself? Well, obviously our pastors, our leaders, and bishops aren't saying do this in remembrance of me David, or me Ignatius. They're saying do this in remembrance of me, the Lord. The Lord is the one who says this. But while the Lord is ascended and at the right hand of God the Father, someone has to say his part for him. Someone has to be in that role or persona. And so for Ignatius, when the bishop is in persona Christi and says things like, do this in remembrance of me, you should obey him as the Lord. Okay, since we brought up the idea of a bishop and the bishop's office, I need to stop now and do a quick run through of how the bishop's office developed. From New Testament times, where it seems to be they're meeting in house to house, and they're even called presbyters or elders, how do we get to the full-blown hierarchy of the church we see later? Well, there's a thousand caveats I'd like to give here, but we don't have time for all those here. So this is just an introductory whirlwind tour of what we know the bishop's office did over time. So let's start with that earliest phase. You have in the first century clear testimony that bishops were somehow supervisors, overseers of house churches. But there does seem to be some sort of collective idea of these bishops together, bishops plural, or elders, presbyters plural. So you have it in some way, in any given city, a collection of these leaders. Maybe they were elders within one house church. That's actually the predominant theory, best I can tell, among the scholars. And then there's another option. Maybe each house church had its own bishop, with, of course, deacons in both of these models. But in the second theory, the bishop of his house church would also be in communication with and coordination with other bishops, other overseers of other house churches. But then something develops in a second phase. Now, in the second phase, what you have is more coordination between these different house churches, or at least more structure to how these elders work together. So, back to our two theories. What I think is the predominant theory, the closest thing to a consensus among scholars, is that in the earliest churches, all of these elders were also called bishops within one house church, within one community. But eventually, one person was elevated over the others. I guess it's something like this. It was too hard to say, hey, who's going to lead the sermon today? Who's going to serve Eucharist today? Who's going to pray the prayer, read the scripture? Instead of everybody just taking turns, let's have one person in charge. And so one of these presbyters was elevated to the role of sole bishop. So the title here is monepiscopate. Monarchical bishops. That way you're focusing on the oneness. Only one bishop is really in charge. And all the other presbyters work along with that bishop. That's the first theory. But there is a second theory that says maybe, back to our first phase, each house church had its own bishop. But as they worked together more and more, they tried to pool their resources. We know they're doing this for charitable works. They're trying to pool their resources for sharing scriptures, sharing texts with each other. So maybe as they did this, they realized, okay, we need one person who is a supervisor, overseer, bishop over all these other house churches. We'll keep calling them elders or presbyters, but let's have only one monepiscopate, one monarchical bishop. Now, there's pros and cons to both theories. I happen to side with the second theory, but I may have bias involved in that. So there's a lot you can read and to be said about this subject in the secondary literature. But let's move on to the third phase. The third phase is where we talk about one bishop in a diocese, so diocesan bishops. And this is going to look very much like theory B of that second phase, because in any given city, you're assuming now that all these churches are working together under one bishop, like a monarchical bishop. This is virtually the same thing, except what you would assume has changed here is instead of this being so much a bottom up, we're pooling our resources together and putting them in one common purse in the hands of one bishop. And we're pulling our scriptures and things together and letting one person help coordinate how they're read and shared. Now this is top down. This bishop is appointing priests or presbyters in local house churches. This priest is excommunicating people all over the city. So whatever the diocese is, and early on it's probably just one city, but that eventually spreads to become a whole county, region, whatever. This bishop is the head honcho in charge of all the other clergy under them. Now that brings us to our fourth phase. In the fourth phase, what you've really done is just added a level of the hierarchy. So this is called a metropolitan or a metropolitan bishop. And that's kind of a strange word until you realize what it's talking about, the largest metropolis in the area. And the idea here is that as all of these different bishops are over their different cities in this one region, they too want to coordinate across the whole region. And so even though they are responsible for their individual dioceses, they work together under one, something like an archbishop. And some of them are even specially classified as patriarchs for reasons we can't go into. But this patriarch or archbishop or metropolitan is sort of the final say in coordinating people from different cities, different dioceses, different regions. At least so far, if we think of this as phase 4. Phase 5, final one. This is where you have simply just put the very last cone on the top of this pyramid. You've taken the logic to its highest extent. If each city needs its own bishop and each region needs its own archbishop, well, what about the whole worldwide church? Surely you need a shepherd of the shepherds. And so you get to the idea of the papacy as not just being the Bishop of Rome, which he is, and not just being the Patriarch of the West, which he is, but also being the Pope, the Papa, father of the whole church, the vicar, representing Christ as head over the whole church in persona Christi. While Christ is absent at the right hand of God the Father, the Pope is over all the church. So it's the complete hierarchy here. Now, I said there's a million caveats to give here. I need to at least work in a few. These phases can roughly, to oversimplify, be divided by centuries. First 100 years, you're looking at phase 1. Phase 2 for the second 100 years, etc., etc. There's more overlap and more complications than that makes it seem, but it's a good mental way to remember this. Also, there would be a traditional Catholic view that would say these aren't phases at all. These are simply the rungs on the hierarchy, and there was always a pope. Peter was always the first head of the church over all the other apostles and bishops. But I've said this before. This is not just propaganda as a Protestant. Roman Catholic historians today, by and large, admit that the church had to develop over time. So even if you would say as a Catholic that Peter was given the keys to the kingdom and was theologically the first pope, he did not function the way that, say, the Pope does today. He's not the general giving commands over everyone else. And the bishops of Rome for a long time never really had that kind of authority, although you start to see over the centuries they recognize their influence over other churches, and the bishops of Rome come to have more and more of a sense of themselves as the true head of all Christians. Now there's another caveat. Eastern Orthodox Christians don't think there should have ever been a phase 5. If the Bishop of Rome just saw himself as the Patriarch of the West, along with these other patriarchs, we would all get along. He's first among equals. Well, there's been this great schism between East and West, and even then, while traditional Eastern Orthodoxy would say Ignatius was always the Patriarch of Syria, not just Antioch, the whole region, there are numbers, probably the vast majority of Eastern Orthodox scholars would happily concede that the church had to develop over time, and that they would simply say these developments were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So this is meant to happen, and it's okay to have these in phases. But for all this is for our sake to see how Ignatius is the first to differentiate presbyters from deacons. And exactly what's going on with his church is still up for debate, but he writes to people like Polycarp and calls him a bishop, but Polycarp, in his own letters that survive, calls himself an elder, a presbyter. So Ignatius, in his letters, has a difference between the office of bishop and the office of presbyter. Polycarp still does not. Or there's some, maybe these offices developed at different places, at different times. It's hard to know exactly how to get to the transition points between them. It takes a lot of detailed study. But hopefully this overview helps you see the sort of thing Ignatius is assuming. He's not just thinking of the house church anymore, and yet he's also not seeing the full-blown development of patriarchs and the papacy as they will later be known. But he has a very important role to play as bishop, and therefore things that he does in his life, even in his death, is going to be hugely influential on his church. So now that brings us to his view of martyrdom. So Ignatius is on his way to be martyred. He seems to know he's going to be fed to the lions, and he doesn't want anybody to stop it. He seems really excited, but seemingly too excited. He says things like, "I want my bones ground like wheat in the jaws of the lion." Why is he so excited about this? And he talks about himself. He uses the word sacrifice. He's going to be a sacrifice. Well, hasn't Jesus already been the sacrifice? And the answer is yes. But remember, Ignatius has been in this role, what we called with the Latin term in persona Christi. As bishop, he has been playing the role of Christ each week. And remember what happens in the liturgy of the church, in what's really like a play, the drama, is in a sense martyr practice. It's a rehearsal of Christ's own martyrdom, his own death. And for Christians, it seems to be a rehearsal or a practice of what will be ours. So here's how you have to think about it. Remember, Ignatius says, obey the bishop as the Lord. But what's the bishop asking you to do? He's asking you to come to the table and do this, the breaking of the bread, the giving of the cup. He says, do this in remembrance of me. And as he does this, remember, this is the same table that in many sources is also called an altar. Now, it's a movable table, but it's called an altar because you lay your sacrifice on it. We read in the Didache where it says, bring your offerings to the Lord. You can read in other texts like the apostolic tradition that you can give certain things on the altar, certain offerings. If you're a farmer, you lay wheat on the offering. If you're a baker, you lay bread on the offering. If you have an olive grove, you lay olive or olive oil on the altar. And that is your livelihood. It's symbolically, sure, your very life that you're laying on the altar as a sacrifice to God. Now, why do you do this? Well, because this is the same altar that you've been coming to week after week, and you know that Christ first laid his life, symbolically, sure, but he lays himself here on this same altar, even in this, sometimes this same bread that we are offering. You see, it is what some would call a mystical communion, the mystical union with Christ. Just as Christ has offered himself on the altar of sacrifice for us, so we offer our livelihood and our lives on this altar every week. And so when Ignatius, who seems to be very boisterous and very hyperbolic in the way he talks, when he knows he's going to be sacrificed and knows he's going to be fed to the lions, he doesn't want people mourning this. He doesn't want people questioning this. He's excited about this because this is what he signed up for. After all, Jesus told the disciples, take up your cross and follow me. So in this chance to be the sacrifice that we've been claiming that we're making, Ignatius is very excited about this. In fact, remember, he doesn't just want to be fed to the lions. He wants his bones crushed like what? Like wheat. Like the wheat that should make you think in early Christianity, the wheat, the bread of the Eucharist. Yes, we'll see in other texts like Polycarp. Polycarp is martyred. They try to burn him at the stake, but it doesn't kill him. In fact, it says he just has a glow and he smells like bread baking. You see, martyrs, early Christians understood themselves and through this sort of Eucharistic, mystical union with Christ as a sacrifice, but not one that pays for salvation, a sacrifice offered freely because Christ has paid for salvation. And he did that by the way of the cross, and he asks his disciples to take up their cross and follow him. Okay, we need to wrap up what we're saying about Ignatius, but there is one last question for him. He's so excited about martyrdom, and he's so determined to be martyred. He tells the Christians in Rome, don't try to interfere in any way or intercede. He seems to say he has to be martyred to truly be saved. He says at one point, I only just now begin to be a disciple. Does Ignatius think that the only way to be saved is to be martyred as a sacrifice? Well, he doesn't precisely answer that question. And what I mean is, if you asked him, what about all the other Christians who haven't been arrested and who never make it into the arena and are never fed to the lions? Are they not saved? And since he never directly answers that question, we can't be 100% sure what he would say. But I'm going to take a stab at it. I think if you asked him, do you have to be a martyr to be saved, to be a Christian, to go to heaven, to be with Jesus? And the answer I think Ignatius would say is yes. But now again, there's a huge issue here. You always have to say, what do you mean by martyr? Because remember, that word martyr in Greek, which is just borrowed into Latin and then English, it literally means a witness, someone who gives a testimony in a courtroom. And that's what Christ called his disciples to be. He tells his disciples in Acts 1:8, you shall be my witnesses. But now, that Greek word is martyr. And you have to imagine the first readers of Acts, when they heard that, they know the irony. They know it literally means witnesses, people who speak forth the truth. But they also know what it's going to come to mean. People like Stephen and Peter and Paul are all going to die for their testimony. It's going to cost them their very lives. Now you combine that with what you see in other New Testament texts. By the end of the New Testament, in Revelation, you see where the souls of the martyrs are crying out for vengeance for their blood. Now you know that they're dead. So it's the martyrs now, same word. It's not just souls of witnesses in the sense of any witness. It's the souls of these witnesses. These witnesses who have been so faithful to Christ, it cost them their lives. But remember, this is what Jesus seems to ask of his disciples. He says, take up your cross and follow me. And he also says things like, the one who perseveres to the end shall be saved. And the way this is interpreted unanimously by the early Christians that we will call Orthodox Christians, they all understand that if you are ever arrested and tried for your faith, and you at any point deny Christ, fall from the faith, then you would not be saved. Because Jesus himself says, if you deny me before men, most translations say, before humans, I will deny you before my Father in heaven. But if you confess me, there's that idea of martyrdom, of testimony, of witness. If you confess me before men, people on earth, I will confess you before my Father in heaven. So early Christians, you could debate later, as we will in Protestant times, what if someone looks like a Christian, talks like a Christian, acts like a Christian all their life, and then at the very end deny Christ? Were they ever really saved? Maybe they weren't ever really saved. Or maybe they were saved and you can lose your salvation. That's a later debate about the internal state. What the early Christians are certain of in the external state is, if arrested, you must confess Christ boldly. You must go forward and you cannot deny Christ. To be a witness is to be a faithful witness, the one who perseveres to the end. But now, what about all those people back in Antioch who didn't get arrested, didn't get taken with Ignatius to Rome, didn't get fed to the lions? Well, Ignatius has good news for them. You don't necessarily have to be martyred in a blaze of glory, thrown to the lions, but you do have to be a martyr, a witness, and a faithful witness even unto death. So you'll find in texts, like texts about Thecla. Thecla never dies in an arena, but she's called a martyr. In the life of Anthony, Anthony is said to be one of the first or founders of the monastic movement. Anthony wants to die as a martyr, but he's never arrested and never has that chance. And yet he lives out his life bearing his cross, dying to self daily. And at the end of his life, in the story, the records, he's called a martyr because he's a faithful witness even unto death. So yes, to truly be saved in the sense of have eternal life, you must be a martyr. But what do we mean by martyr? We mean a witness to Christ, a faithful witness, and one who perseveres to the end. So we'll see other texts about martyrdom. We'll see other ideas involved in this, but hopefully Ignatius was a good entry point into what this means for early Christians, what it costs them, and what they're willing to sacrifice for their sense of following Christ.
That was it? Do it again. Come on.